Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. And a warm welcome to the afternoon show. I'm Bill Arnold, and when a Hebrew scholar spends time in Genesis chapter 28, I can promise that interesting things are going to happen. My guest today is Dr. Rebecca Rhee, and she's going to spend the hour with us talking about Same Place, Different Perspective. What a fascinating title, Rebecca. So glad to have you back.
Oh, it's a joy to be back, Bill.
Yeah, and I love that you have spent time in Genesis chapter 28. You did your homework, and now you're ready to share it with us.
Well, it's a fascinating place to be, so I was more than happy to spend a lot of time there.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your place in the corner of the world. What do you mean by that? That's very interesting.
Well, I was just thinking, as I was reading Genesis 28, it really began to impress upon me the importance of your sense of place to your identity, and what place means to how you think about yourself and the trajectory of your life, where you're going. Who am I and where am I going? And a sense of place really defines those things. And so if I were to ask you, what's your place in your corner of the world, you might say, take me to your office and show me that. You might take me to your home and give me a tour of your house. You might take me to your place of worship, if that's central to your life. You might even take me to a place in nature where you find yourself relaxing and feeling centered. And all of these places in the natural sense help define who you are. But I started to ask myself, is place more than just a physical location? Could it be a state of mind or a state of spirit? And so if I asked you, what is your place in God's kingdom? Then all of a sudden we're in a different realm altogether, because you are starting to deal with what is your meaning, what is your purpose, who do you believe God created you to be, and what is he calling you to devote your life to in terms of your sense of place in God's kingdom? So I wanted to look at Genesis 28 specifically and ask, how does that sense of physical place start to transform into something much greater, which becomes a sense of spiritual place or supernatural place? And what does that do to the believer? Specifically in God, the believer in God.
And Rebecca, because this is so important, I want you to say that one more time, just the last part, about how your physical space might contribute to your place in kingdom work. Did I have that right?
I would say that we all begin with the physical place, and it's for us to get quiet inside of ourselves and look out into the world, or look into the scriptures if you're a person who believes in scripture, and look into stories and relationships that you have and say, is place more than just this physical space that I occupy? Is it actually like a destiny? Is it actually a calling on my life? Is there more than to place than just this physical space that I'm occupying?
Okay, I like this premise very much. This is very interesting. So let's get into the text. We are in Genesis chapter 28 with Dr. Rebecca Rhee. Do you want to do the pleasure of doing the scripture reading?
Sure. I will have the pleasure of reading. So we're going to start at verse 10 of chapter 28, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version. So this is verse 10. Jacob left Beer-sheva and went towards Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. And behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of the place Beit El, but the name of the city was Luth at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you.
And that
is the word.
Endeth the word, Genesis chapter 28, starting in verse 10 through the end of the chapter, which takes us through verse 22. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. And it was interesting because when I read this text, both in the English and the Hebrew, I discovered that there was an interesting pattern, and you might have heard it because we talked a little bit about place, and then I read it for you. You might have heard the repetition. The storyteller uses the word place, and in Hebrew it's makom, 6 times in this passage, and it's always in a definite form, meaning the place or that place. It's never just a place. It's the place or that place. So 3 of the times, the storyteller clusters the word place in an ordinary sense as he describes what's happening to Jacob in the beginning of the story. And then towards the end of the passage, there's a second cluster of the word place that comes out of Jacob's own mouth. And that is in a supernatural sense. So our study is going to orbit around these 2 clusters. One is an ordinary place and one is an extraordinary place. And how do we get from one to the other?
I like the word makom.
Makom.
The word for place. Almost sounds like my home.
Well, it could.
It could be. Welcome to Macomb.
So as for the ordinary sense of place, let's start by looking at verse 11, where we find that word densely repeated 3 times in that one verse. And he came to a certain place and stayed there the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. So I have to ask.
Okay, Rebecca.
Sure.
Rebecca, I wouldn't have seen that in a thousand years. That what you just pointed out. It's beautiful.
Well, I've blown past it, all my life. But when you start looking at English and Hebrew together, and you start hearing it together, especially knowing that biblical Hebrew, it's all about the ringing of the bells. That's what I call it. Biblical Hebrew loves to repeat. And when you hear a word said over and over again, that means, hello, pay attention here. There's a little nugget of meaning to be found. So as it came across in both languages, I was like, okay, something's going on here. So what is the storyteller wanting us to know about Jacob by the fact that he repeats place 3 times in reference to him. So I wanted to give a little context about Jacob, like where is he in his life at this point when this happens? And according to the prophecy that's given to Rebecca, who is Jacob's mom, when she was pregnant with him and his twin brother Esau, apparently they were fighting in her womb, and she prayed to God and said, why are they fighting? And the Lord told her that Jacob was destined to rule over his older brother. So although Esau was going to come out first, it was Jacob that was going to rule over the older one. And that was not the custom. Usually it was the firstborn son that would rule over the younger one. And the other thing we know about Jacob is that he's not above resorting to what I call sly opportunism. So he sees an opportunity. If it's a little bit shady, so what? We're going to go, I see it, I'm going to take it. And he is definitely not above employing deceit to get what he wants when he fools his father into thinking he's Esau and gets the blessing. So that's another thing we know about Jacob. And finally, in this very moment, what's happening to him is he is fleeing home because Esau has figured out what Jacob has done, and he's vowing retaliation, and Jacob has to leave. And Rebecca, his mother, knows it, so she, sends him away. And the cover story that his dad gives is that he needs to travel to his mother's family in Haran to find a proper wife. He doesn't want his son to intermingle with the local women. He wants, the proper bloodline from his mother's side. So he has to go all the way back to Haran to get to that proper wife. So I thought about people like Abraham and like Isaac and how they traveled. Like it would talk about Abraham pitching a tent or having a servant to help with the firewood. And Jacob doesn't have any traveling companions like a servant. And he doesn't seem to have any real provisions like a tent or an animal, like a pack animal. I don't even think he has like a clear map or a clearer sense of direction of where he's going, because I read ahead in the book of Genesis, and when he finally gets there, he has to ask around, like, hey, have you ever heard of this, this person and this person? He doesn't really even know if he's arrived at the right place. So
that sounds like me.
It sounds like a lot of us.
Yeah.
And so in short, Jacob is a fugitive, and he's very, very needy. And when the storyteller talks about the stone beneath Jacob's head, it reminded me of that time that Jesus was on that storm-tossed boat after a full day of ministry, and somebody put a pillow under his head, and he was fast asleep upon that pillow, even though the boat was being completely flooded. So I would say chances are Jacob is as exhausted as Jesus seemed to be after a full day of ministry. It's not easy being a fugitive. So he's running away from trouble. He's needy. He's not well provisioned. He's exhausted, and he's headed towards an uncertain destination. And I have to say, is any of this sounding familiar to any of you? That feeling of the things that Jacob felt when he stopped at Beit El for the night. Are you in a place where you'd like God to show up precisely because you're in trouble? It could be physical health. It could be financial problems at work or with your family. I'm guessing it's not hard to identify what your troublesome place is. So we'll think about that for a minute. But to return to Jacob's natural place, in this natural place, he has a dream there of angels going up and down on a ladder. And that ladder is the only time that's used in the entire Hebrew Bible. It's a unusual and unique word. In Hebrew, it's a sulam. And it doesn't so much mean like a fireman's ladder, when you picture that in your head. It's more like a great big staircase that would lead to the top of a temple. So think of that in the ancient world when they had these, grand staircases leading up to a temple. That's what the text is talking about. And the angels of God are going up and down on it, which makes a little more sense than just going up and down on a fireman's ladder.
Yeah, and that's called a sulam, S-U-L-A-M.
Sulam, yes, a sulam.
Okay.
So God stands beside it, and he introduces himself to Jacob. And we'll get to what he says to Jacob in a moment. But I want to, before we do that, go to the second cluster of the word place that I was talking about, where the meaning starts to shift from the natural to the supernatural, from the ordinary to the extraordinary. And so let's drop down, if we're looking at the extraordinary sense of place, let's drop down to verses 16 and 17. Jacob wakes up from his dream and he says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid. And he said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And then down in verse 19, and he called the name of the place Beit El. And in the Hebrew, Beit El means house of God, quite literally. So,
and Rebecca,
sure.
just for the sake of people who have not heard that name pronounced that way, most of us would say Bethel.
Yep, or Bethel. I've heard people say
or
Bethel, but it's it's Beit El, because Beit means house of, and El is a name for God.
Yeah, but if you're in your car and you don't have your Bible open and you know Genesis 28 well enough that you go Beit El. I've never heard of that before, but we would probably think of it as Bethel or Bethel. All right, let me take a little break. Dr. Rebecca Rhee is our guest, and we are in Genesis chapter 28. We'll be right back. We carry each other's burdens. Please know you can bring us your prayer concerns, and we will pray. Share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio team by texting or calling 877-933-2484, or share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio staff and listeners at myfaithradio.com. Welcome to the show. Dr. Rebecca Rhee is my guest. You can learn more about her at RebeccaRhee.net. That's RHEE. And we are studying with her in Genesis chapter 28. And whenever you have a Hebrew scholar that's an expert at analyzing storytelling, you are in the right place, because this is a fascinating account in Genesis 28 as we look at Jacob. All right. He is obviously is a little bit confused, as he doesn't know exactly where he landed. But I had to laugh during the break, Rebecca, because I thought, that is, once again, sounds like me.
Well, there's a reason why it's in the Bible, isn't there? So we can all read it.
Yes, there is.
So whatever Jacob might think of this dream that he's had, it's not like we think of like Freudian dreams today, like, oh, that was just a dream. This impacts Jacob profoundly, and he totally believes in the reality of this and the truth of this. And it definitely transforms the way that he sees where he is, even though he's still in the same place. I mean, he wakes up in the same place that he went to sleep. And it elicits two responses in him that are kind of groundbreaking for Jacob. And the first one is awe. And it says he was afraid. Awe has a healthy dose of fear in it. And worship, which includes him anointing the rock with oil and then giving the place a new name. So it's awe and worship. And what I found very interested in is Jacob is in awe of what he didn't know. You know, usually we think of the experience of spiritual awe is like, I'm going to go to a church, I'm going to go to a service, and I'm going to hear something about, the attributes of God, and I'm going to celebrate the God that I know. But this was Jacob coming face to face, encountering this God that he had no idea. And the fact that this commerce, if I can use that word, this commerce between heaven and earth was happening so intensively and so closely. It's just like the veil torn in two. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that the commerce between heaven and earth was so intense and so close, that this is going on all the time. And he had no inkling that there was a holy presence and what that holy presence is up to. And I thought about that for my own life, and I thought, that's exactly what I want. I don't want to go over the same ground of the things that I've known in the past. And I'm not dissing that. I mean, thank God for the things that we've learned over the past and that we can hold on to and remember when we're in trouble. But don't we want a fresh revelation of God? Don't we want to learn something that we didn't know about him? That involves, I don't care if it involves a little bit of fear. I would rather be knocked back on my heels by a revelation of God's nearness, because worship for me seems to be the first thing that goes out the window when I'm in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And this worship is exactly where Jacob lands when he has this revelation of what he doesn't know about God. So let's go to that place. What does God say to Jacob to elicit this awe and worship? What is God saying to impress him with this supernatural sense of place? And I call it the 3 P's. There's proliferation, provision, and I can get to my notes, and protection. So I'll just go over these very, very briefly so we can have other things to talk about. But proliferation basically means Jacob's going to multiply. Here he is, this lone fugitive. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have any prospects. But God's saying, you're going to be like the dust of the earth, and you're going to spread in all these directions. And this is exactly precisely the dust of the earth spreading in all directions is exactly what he says to Abraham. So he's giving Jacob the very same promise that he gave to his grandfather. And it's also a way of saying you're going in the right direction. So then after proliferation, there's provision. And not only is Jacob going to be blessed, but he's going to be so comprehensively, overwhelmingly blessed that God said he's going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. I mean, that's almost you almost can't process that. Like, what a legacy that is. You know, a high calling and a high purpose is that, and God says, you and your family, you personally, individually, Jacob and your family are going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. I mean, I'm just trying to affect a few people in my inner circle. I can't imagine like being told that I was going to affect, everyone on the planet. And one specific way I thought that this happened was Jacob ends up having a son named Joseph. And at one point, Joseph rises to the position and power of governor of Egypt, and he ends up saving a lot of people from starvation, including his family. And that's one way he blesses, Jacob receives and passes on the blessing of God to all the families of the earth. And so then for that last one, it's his family.
If his family starves, the Messiah doesn't come through the line of Judah. So he's got to make sure his family survives.
And not only that, but all those Egyptians and all those other nations that came to Egypt to buy grain. So there's just a lot of people involved in that.
Yeah.
And then as for the protection piece, this gets to me emotionally. Like, I think Jacob's really homesick. He's left his home in really under bad circumstances, and he's had little choice about it in terms of how he had to just get on out of there. And I think he really wants to know that one day he's going to come back, and maybe also on a deeper sense, though he wants it, maybe not wants it at the same time. He knows there's going to be a reckoning at some point, and there is a reckoning. There's always a reckoning for all of us. And he wants to know he's going to survive that reckoning and that he'll be able to come home in peace. So let's look at that vow that Jacob says at the end, because you can tell from what Jacob says upon waking that God has clearly anticipated the things that Jacob wants by his promises. So let's look at how Jacob makes a vow to sort of respond to God's promises. He says, if God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's home in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. and of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. Now, if you ask me to describe this vow kind of overall, I would say the word I would use would be elemental, meaning it's dealing with the bare necessities. These are the things that Jacob believes he needs just to survive. Food, clothing, physical protection, to make it back home one day. These are the bare basics. And I'll stop here and say that there are many, many commentators that condemn Jacob for the way he frames this vow, because here God makes this very gracious and overwhelmingly generous promise to Jacob. He says, I'm going to give you all these things: proliferation, provision, protection. You're going to have this amazing legacy. And Jacob responds by saying, if you do these things, then you'll be my God. But I looked very carefully at the text again, and this is something a lot of people fault Jacob for. I noticed that neither God nor the storyteller seem to condemn Jacob for that if. And if they refrain from condemning him, then I think maybe we should too as readers. We have to think, well, if it's not just opportunism, if it's not just him being kind of a sly, well, if you do this, then I'll, being a cynic maybe, what is it then? And I think Jacob is simply responding with childlike honesty. I think if you ask any one of us, if God could say something overwhelmingly kind and good to any one of us, and if it's in a place where we don't really know, because at this point, Jacob's never really been addressed by God directly. If it's in a place where our faith is small and we don't really know God there, I think we respond in these elemental, basic, childlike ways, naming the things that the bare bones kind of things that we think we need to survive. So we all have to begin with where we are before God rather than try to be someone that we're not. We just have to start from that place of, these are the things I need in order to believe these amazing things that you just said to me.
So, Rebecca, there are some commentators that have faulted Jacob, saying, how dare you approach God and say, if you'll be with me?
Right. Right.
Seems like that is your basic human condition sometimes.
Yeah, and I think God knows that. Again, It would be very, very easy for the storyteller to condemn Jacob outright in the story and say, because Jacob, think about the story of when Zechariah is approached by the angel to be told that his wife Elizabeth is going to get pregnant. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, how will I know that this is going to happen? And the angel says, I am Gabriel and I stand before God. And because you have this insolence, you're not going to speak until the baby's born. And remember, he loses his voice. So the Bible is quite capable of condemning insolence like that, but we don't see that happening here. And I think that's because Jacob is extending a step of faith. It may be a small baby step. It may be something that we on the outside look at and say, well, how could he? It's almost an insult. But I think God knows his heart. And I think God knows our hearts when we have to take the smallest of steps, but it's at least an honest and heartfelt step.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, I want in heaven to go to the seminar that's all about tone, where the tone of which something was said in Scripture, because I would love to know how Jacob said the word, if you'll be with me. And I also think of Gabriel talking to Zacharias, and when he says, I am Gabriel, I would love to know the tone of which he said it.
Yes.
So maybe we'll learn that at the tone seminar, which I want to sign up for. All right, let's take a little break. Dr. Rebecca Rhee is my guest. You can learn more about her at her website, RebeccaRhee.net. That's RHEE. We'll be right back with lots more. We are in Genesis chapter 28.
It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold. Prime time, drive time. Let's get it started. Jump in your car. Yeah. What's for dinner? Hey. It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold.
Genesis chapter 28 is where we are in discussion today with Dr. Rebecca Rhee. Fascinating study. You can learn more about Rebecca at RebeccaRhee.net. She spells her last name R-H-E-E. Right after the break, we were talking about the vow that Jacob was making. And I don't want to get sidetracked here, Rebecca, but when he makes this vow, tell me what you think about anyone that's making a vow with God.
You mean like today?
Or anytime.
I think that vow making is a way of putting yourself on the line, of demonstrating that you're ready to invest yourself in something that's not a superficial commitment, but it's going to basically cost you something. I think making a vow says you can't make a vow to do something positive in the sense of I'm making this vow to perform this act without there being accompanying negative in the sense of, and it might cost me. Like when a couple make a vow to get married, the part that's the costly part is forsaking all others, right? So it makes the vow of I'm pledging myself to you means nothing if you don't have the other piece of it, which is and the way I pledge myself to you is by forsaking all others. I'm only going to exclusively pledge myself to you. So vows seem to have two parts, just to say, to demonstrate my true investment and commitment to whatever it is I'm making the vow, there has to be something that costs me along the way, or it doesn't really count. And we see that happening actually here, because did you notice that Jacob makes a vow and he turns in his language, and I'll talk about that turn in a minute, but his vow is, of all that you give me, a full tenth I will give to you. Now, the reason why I feel like that's a costly vow is because that's measurable. You can measure out when he's given something, whether he actually counted up to 10 and then took one part of that and gave it to God. And in our day and time, we could say, well, I make a vow, and we have to be careful with the vows that we make, but you can say, I guess maybe I would be more comfortable with the language. I make a commitment, a serious commitment to, growing in my quiet times this year by making sure that I get alone with God at least 3 times a week. Well, that's measurable. So I would say vows come in part, like is the pledge and the promise. And then there's the part where you follow up in some kind of tangible way that costs you something and that can be measured. Does that make sense?
It makes a ton of sense. And I loved your description of that. I thought that was perfect. Thank you.
So did you notice that I talked about that Jacob makes a turn in his vow, and it's just like the turn that we see happening in Psalm 23, where the psalmist says, he restores my soul, and then he moves to, I will fear no evil, for your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So first he's talking about God in the third person, he restores my soul. And then all of a sudden he's talking to God in the second person. I will fear no evil, for your rod and staff, they comfort me. And that's from Psalm 23. And in the same way, Jacob says, I will give a full tenth to you. So he's been talking about God in the third person and all these things that he's seeing and in all this revelation. And then he ends the whole thing by vowing a vow and saying, I'm going to do this measurable, costly thing to you or for you. So that's, I think that's, for a guy like Jacob, that's big. For a guy who's all about, also, being an go ahead.
Yeah, it's also so personal and intimate, and this is how we should be sacrificing to the Lord, to Him.
Yes. Well, and I think it almost, when you're talking about the Lord and you're making like a commitment to Him, it almost doesn't like really count unless you turn at least in the slightest way and address that commitment to Him, because otherwise then it's just like, I guess the book of James would call it works. It's not faith, it's works. It's just you saying, well, I'm going to perform, like a vending machine, I'm going to perform this act, and so I expect this result. So I don't think that's what God is looking for. I think He would rather have a great big if in what you're saying, if it means that at the end of that if statement, you turn and address Him specifically. So I just want to point out that lest we think, well, Jacob gets off pretty easy. He gets away with this stuff where he steals everything from his brother, and then God quite graciously appears in this dream and promises him all these wonderful things. And then, Jacob makes this vow and ends up going on. I want to point out that Jacob will have plenty, and I mean plenty, of challenges ahead of him to grow his faith in God. He will have to tussle with he meets his match. When he meets his mother's brother, he will have to tussle with this wily uncle. This guy, as wily as he is, to acquire the wife that he wants, which is his uncle's daughter. He'll have to wrestle with an angelic creature to obtain a blessing that he needs to survive. And he's also going to have to face his brother Esau, whom he is convinced will kill him and all his family when they finally see each other out of revenge, like long-held revenge. So he's going to have, even though he looks like maybe he's getting off a little easy, he's not going to get off easy at all. There'll be plenty of opportunities for him to believe. And I think God provides us plenty of opportunities.
There's a lot on his plate. There's no question.
Right. Exactly. So, I guess I wanted to ask, in what kind of place are you in now? Are you in the kind of place with lots of rocks in it? Or are you in the kind of place where you're getting revelation from heaven about what you didn't know about God and about how God works? I think that if we bring our neediness and exhaustion to God and we lay it before Him like an offering almost, it's almost like that oil that Jacob pours upon the pillar that he sets up. I think some things are going to start happening in our lives. I can give you an example from my own life, if you would like.
I would love that.
So in my own life, I've shared before that I'm a mom to an autistic 12-year-old son. And he had a birthday in August. And my husband and I were kind of lamenting the fact that you can't really throw a birthday party for someone if they don't have any friends. And my son is very socially isolated. And so he has no friends. And so, we were just thinking, this is, and I get, all my friends who have children, I see pictures that they send me, and, it's painful. Not that you don't want your friends to have birthday parties for their children, but, it's just hard to look at that and think, I'll never have that for my kid. Here he is, 12 years old, and we haven't had a real birthday party for him. So August came and went, and then he rides a special transportation van to and from school, and it only carries special needs kids. So if you're on that van, you've got a diagnosis. They don't share what those are, of course, for privacy reasons, but the kids there have issues. And one day the van pulled up to my house after school, and as I opened the door, this little boy exclaimed to me, "He's my friend," just like that. "He's my friend." And my astonishment just must have shown up on my face because the driver said to me, the kid had dropped his water bottle and my son had reached over and gotten it, retrieved it for him and given it to him. And that is, I mean, for a kid with autism to initiate contact and to do something kind of altruistic like that, you know, like selfless, "Oh, here's your bottle back," is very unusual, at least for my son. And I just thought, you know, and then the driver said this is the moment where the angels were going up and down on the ladder. She said, "You know, your son does interact with the other children." And I was like, I did not know that at all. That was my moment of, I've just encountered something I did not know was going on right under my nose. And so it gave me just a little morsel of faith to believe that God is working in the life of my boy in a way that I can't even fathom. And it gives me a direction to pray in, to say, this is just a little, you know, revelation, but I'm going to follow this down and see where it leads.
That is such a sweet story. My goodness. Rebecca Rhee is my guest. We are going to take a short break and come back as we are studying Genesis chapter 28. And if you want to learn more about Rebecca, her website address is RebeccaRhee.net, RHEE. We'll be right back. Welcome is a word said universally all over the world. Every language on the planet has their own way of making a friendly greeting. At Faith Radio, when we welcome, we really mean it. Learn more about us by requesting a free welcome pack gift. Text the word WELCOME to 877-933-2484 or visit myfaithradio.com to request your welcome pack today. And a warm welcome to you. Welcome to the show. If you just tuned in, Dr. Rebecca Rhee is my guest. We are talking about Genesis chapter 28, but right before we went to break, she was talking about a very heartwarming story of her son who is 12 years old. And like you were saying, Rebecca, you are learning things in ways that God is working in our lives and surprising us with things that are really spectacular.
Mm-hmm. That one was.
Yeah, and it probably just gave you a little boost of faith that God is working in the life of your son and in ways that you just couldn't put your finger on that one. So this was really inspiring to hear that about the story of his friendship.
I want to encourage people that, you know, I think I don't remember what book it's in, but there is one that says, do not despise the day of small things, meaning, you know, sometimes if you want to see these revelations of the things you didn't know that will end up being huge in your life, you have to look small. You have to look for the small things. And I realized, well, maybe if I want my son to have a friend, I have to pursue this little avenue that just opened up, you know, and see where that leads, instead of just being cynical and saying, oh, well, you know, it's just one kid on a bus. How much could that mean? And he's got his own problems and whatever. Nope. You really have to be willing to pursue what looks like a small thing and see where it goes.
Mm-hmm. And that's Zechariah chapter 4, verse 10.
Thank you.
Who dares despise the day of small things, since the seven eyes of the Lord that range throughout the earth will rejoice when they see the chosen capstone in the hand of Zerubbabel.
I wanted to bring up another.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you for looking it up. I wanted to bring up another verse as a way of kind of wrapping all of this up, which is Malachi 3:10. And it deals with that tenth, that tithe that Jacob vows to give God. I found this parallel. I was like, oh, this is also about a tithe. And God is speaking in the first person, and he says to his people, bring the full tenth into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until there is no more need. Malachi 3:10.
Say more about that, Rebecca. This is very interesting.
I think the idea of God wanting to be put to the test, that's interesting. I think that goes
It's
right
super
along
interesting.
with, yeah, I think that goes right along with him not being offended by Jacob's if.
Mm-hmm.
He's standing there ready. I mean, it's almost like he said to Jacob, oh, put me to the test. I'll take that if. I'll take that if from you. And then we're going to see where we go with that if. And that's when all those interesting things happen to Jacob, that he has to grow in his faith and his walk with God. God is basically saying here, do that thing, invest in that commitment that costs you something in a tangible way that's measurable, and see if I don't respond in a way that bowls you over. And speaking of being bowled over, I just wanted to say that that little story about my son, it's currently on my latest blog post on my website if you want to read a little bit more about how that went.
And that is at RebeccaRhee.net, correct?
Yep, and the pod blog post is called Water Bottle.
Okay.
Simply Water Bottle, yeah. But yeah.
Well, I really like how we got started when we talk about how we identify ourselves, how we communicate with each other. This place is maybe more than a physical place. A lot of the times we'll talk news, weather, and sports in the very beginning. I usually like going with who are you and what makes you tick, because I think that's always more interesting. But I've never thought too much about where you are is being something in terms of how God is designing your life and calling you into kingdom work. And I think this passage has been a real eye-opener as to what point you were trying to make with that today.
I think if we're not careful, we could end up in the wrong place and dither our lives away without finding our true purpose. And so you can tell a lot about a person by the kinds of places they choose to be. Do you know what I mean? Like,
oh, do I ever?
Well, people like, let's say the people who work for the Red Cross, somewhere has a disaster, and that's, instead of running away from it, they run towards it. And you watch them in that place. And you say, this tells me something about this organization by the individuals and where they choose to be. Yeah.
Hopefully my cousin's husband, Dave, is listening right now, because that's what he does. Those kind of heroic episodes of life where he will head into the disaster area.
Yes. Well, and just for ordinary moms and dads, or special needs moms and dads who just every day show up for their kids.
And I love that Jacob went to sleep and woke up with a very different perspective. So maybe that talks about the benefit of a good night's sleep as well.
I'll take that any day, Bill.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So really, so good. It's so interesting to go into the Old Testament, Genesis 28, and you've carried us in a great conversation with stuff that I love the point that we can walk away saying, let God show us what we don't know. But the only problem I had with that statement was just making sure I understand that what we don't know is today comes only from God's word. That's the only way it confirms with me.
What we don't know about you. That's how I would put it.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes perfect sense.
What we don't know about you that we need to know in this moment, because there's a lot we don't know about God, but there's sometimes something very specific about himself that he wants to show us at this time.
Yes. Yes. So good. All right, Rebecca, thank you so much for doing the show. Once again, it's great to hear your teaching, and it's great to have you on the program.
Well, it's, again, my pleasure and my honor to be here.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rebecca Rhee has been my guest. You can learn more about her at RebeccaRhee.net, R-H-E-E. That's our show for the day. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.